We ended up with understanding covenants last time, and I can see in your notes on page 6 is where we were. And we had talked about the definition of what a covenant is, and then we were slowly working our way through this right here to see these 4 aspects. And we started off with the Abrahamic covenant, and the promise for that is found basically in Genesis 12 and 15, and then the obligation is found in Genesis 17. But I want to make sure we have the information that we need here for your notes. You can see little b underneath 1. The promises of this covenant are the land, seed, and the blessing. The obligations are faithfulness to Yahweh and then circumcision. The type of covenant it is what's at the top of the page, and that is what goes in point A. This is a personal or family covenant. Do you have all that information in the right place? I just wanted to make sure. Now, what I do in point D is I simply give you some additional information about the covenants that might be helpful to you. Now, I don't have a point D for every one of the covenants we look at. If you had me in Old Testament history and literature, we looked at this material. Now, what I'm going to do today is we're going to go through this material really quickly because I want to get you to the point. But I do want to make sure you understand some foundational information that's essential for us. Okay? So we're going to move through it quickly. Want to make sure you get the information down. All right, so next would be the Mosaic covenant. Let's look at it. You've already got all those passages written down. Point number 2 is the Mosaic covenant. And A, this is a national covenant. Now think about it for just a moment. Either I'm going to reinforce this or I'm going to make sure you get it for the first time before you leave Biola. This is a national covenant. The covenant with Abraham was made with Abram, and it was with his family, but now his family has grown. They went down to Egypt. They grew into a huge, massive amount of people. So what does God do? Well, the Abrahamic covenant is still functioning. The covenant does not go away, but now God extends this larger covenant to the nation. In other words, this particular covenant is addressing an issue. What does it look like for a nation of Abrahamic covenant believers to live together? What does that look like? And so the promise of this covenant is really that extension of the relationship. And so you see throughout the passages where this covenant is found, especially Exodus 19, where God says, "You will be my people and I will be your God." And they say, "Amen, amen," whatever he says we will do. And so they enter into that covenant relationship. It's a beautiful thing. The obligation of the covenant is obedience to the stipulations of the Mosaic law. Now, a strong point that I want to emphasize for you is this. This obedience to the stipulations of the Mosaic law is not what brought someone into relationship with God. This is absolutely critical for you to understand this. People talk about the Old Testament being about law, the New Testament being about grace. The foundation of any relationship with God is grace. It's only by faith that anyone can have relationship with Him. What this covenant is doing is regulating a nation. You've got all of these people, supposedly, who have entered into a faith relationship. You will be our God. We will entrust our lives to you. Now, once you've made that decision, the Lord says, well, let me show you how to live. If you want to live in relationship with me, this is how you live. And as long as you stay in the circle of blessing, I will bless you. But if you step out of that circle, I will discipline you for your good. It doesn't affect the overall relationship. If you're an Abrahamic believer, then you belong to God. What it does is it gives the stipulations for that relationship as to whether you're being blessed or not. But this is not how someone got saved. And that's a huge misconception of the Old Testament. When the Mosaic covenant comes along, the Abrahamic covenant was not done away with. The Mosaic covenant builds on. It is founded in the Mosaic covenant. It calls for Abrahamic faith. Now, this is the problem, especially when we get to the New Testament. The problem is this. It was possible to have a nation of Mosaic covenant keepers, okay, follow my words, it was possible to have a nation of Mosaic covenant keepers who were not Abrahamic believers. You follow me on that? So the Abrahamic covenant is the foundation. The Mosaic covenant builds on that, but it was possible to be a Mosaic covenant keeper, but not even have the foundation in being an Abrahamic believer. By faith. By faith is how someone enters into a relationship. So when you get to the New Testament, you've got all these Pharisees, and they're saying, what in the world? What is this prophet Jesus' problem? We're keeping all the law. And Jesus says, you don't know God. You haven't entered into that faith relationship. And so one of the difficulties of being in the nation of Israel was putting your trust in your own effort to save you. The same thing can happen in the church too. Okay, there are many things that we're called to do in obedience, correct? But that doesn't earn favor with God. That flows out of a heart that already loves God. And God will discipline us too, right? But that doesn't mean we're kicked out of the family. We've still been adopted. We're adopted, we're underneath His discipline. And the reason God is disciplining us because the things He calls us to in life are for our good. This is where life is found. And so anytime you, in your life, just like with Israel, anytime you step out of the circle of blessing, you will feel, if you're fortunate, the discipline of the Lord, because it's for your good. He wants to get you back in the circle of blessing because that's where life is found. But we can step out of that, can't we? We can go our own way. And maybe some of you right now are stepping out of that circle. You're pulling away from the Lord. You're turning your back on Him. I want to find my own way. I will tell you, the path you're on is death. That's just the bottom line of what it's all about. And so, Old Testament, New Testament, we enter into relationship with God by faith. There's no merit, there's no works, there's nothing. It's simply faith. And when we finally get all these nations, this nation of these people, then they have a new covenant where God says, wow, with all these people, let me tell you how to love me and how to love others so that we can all live together. Every time we have someone come into our house, we have a little sit down. Okay, welcome to our house. Now, we're glad you're here. Yeah, you won't cease to be our friend, or you won't become more of a friend to us, but let me tell you the rules of the house if you want to stay here. This is what happens when we're in our house. We tell that to our kids too. Hey, we aren't trying to be overbearing. This is just the way it's like to live in our house. You want freedom? You want to make your own rules and regulations? Well, move out. That's fine, because freedom is expensive. We will support you. We will help you. We will help you find an apartment. We will do everything we can to get your feet established. If you want to make all your rules, well, fine. It just costs a lot of money. We pay a lot of money to make our rules in our house. And so these are the rules that we have because we pay a lot of money to have these rules. When I go back to my mom and dad's house, got their rules. And so this is what God is doing here. This is relationship. It's the dynamic of relationship that is there. So you understand the difference between Abrahamic, Mosaic? Abrahamic's not gone. Mosaic's not replacing it. And when we get to the next one, the Davidic covenant as well, it's the same thing there. So where are we at now? Page 7 in your notes? Page 7 in your notes. So this is a dynastic covenant. So now, not only do we have a nation, but we have a nation that has continued on. So it's become a dynasty. And it functions under the umbrella of both the Abrahamic and Mosaic covenants, or you can think of it this way again. The Abrahamic covenant is the foundation. Mosaic covenant builds on that. Davidic covenant is now going to build on it as well. And so the promise of this covenant, well, what this covenant does, still with point A, this dynastic covenant, it provides a perpetual ruling dynasty for the nation. They can continue on as a dynasty. They can continue to be a major force. They can continue to be a nation that is under the blessing of God. But God's going to spell that out for them. Because if they don't, then God will remove that blessing for them. So they have the opportunity for this as a nation. And so it provided a perpetual ruling dynasty. Now the king was to be an Abrahamic believer. The king was to function underneath an obedient relationship with the Mosaic covenant. Now, what is the promise of this covenant then? It's a forever throne. In other words, your dynasty will go on, and so God is going to put someone on the throne, and they will continue to be on the throne. This one is made with David, and so David's ruling family. And where does the Messiah come from? David's family. And so ultimately this will be fulfilled despite Israel's disobedience. God is still moving forward his program. And Jesus came as king, was acknowledged as king as he came into Jerusalem, but then he went to the cross and he died, and that was all by plan, but the king is going to come back and he will rightfully take his throne. This is all a part of this dynasty. Now the obligation here was to keep the Mosaic covenant. So right now, this dynasty is not intact, is it? Okay, as far as we would think of, whoa, for the nation of Israel, they've still got a king in the Davidic line. That's not taking place right now, but that's okay because God's bigger plans have already been propelled forward. Jesus has already been here, and he's the ultimate fulfillment of this particular covenant right here. So that's the Davidic covenant. And then we have number 4, which is the new covenant. And this is only introduced in the Old Testament. It's not actually one that we find in the Old Testament. It's predicted in Jeremiah 31:32, but it's not ratified until Luke 22. So when we think about a name for this covenant, this is the final covenant. Okay, that's just a simple way to say it. It's it. There is nothing else that's going to come after this. The redemptive covenant program of the Lord ends right here, or climaxes right here. Now there's other covenants along the way in the Old Testament. These are the 4 major. So you've got the Abrahamic, is by faith you enter into a relationship. It's the Mosaic covenant. In order to maintain this relationship with the Lord, you got to keep the law. As long as you keep the law, there will be a forever throne. But really, when you look at the Old Testament, outside of God doing an incredible work in the heart, it's not going to happen. So in this final covenant, what we have is the regeneration of the heart. We become new creatures. It's no longer a law written on tablets of stone. It's now a law written on the heart. And we live out of being new creation. And so what's the promise of this? It's rest. And so that's our promise right now. We are in the new covenant. And what does God promise us? Rest. Okay, that is his promise to you. So when you are in his circle of blessing, what will you be experiencing? It's not a trick question. Rest, right? Well, the blessing will be rest. When you are outside of that circle, what will be there? Anxiety, fear, okay, all these things that will be there. God promises us this, but then he gives us an obligation. And the obligation is that we are to yoke ourselves with Christ. Well, wow, you can talk about that for quite a while, can't you, about what it means to be yoked with Christ. But when you think about 2 ox that would be, carrying a cart behind it, and they are yoked together. If we are yoked with Christ, then somehow we are to be patterning our lives after Christ. What does it mean to live out Christ in you? What does it mean for Christ to be our example and we are to walk in his steps? It means ultimately that where we're going to find life, where we're going to find joy, where we're going to find peace and rest is going to be by walking in the steps of Christ. And so we can get this all messed up in the world that we live in. And so all of you need to listen to that. You need to pay attention. This is what God wants for you. This is not a result of money. This is not the result of fame or position or accomplishment. None of that is going to bring you this. It's only by being yoked with Christ. And remember, when Christ walks the face of the earth, he turns upside down what we think true living is and what it means to be successful. He turns it upside down. And so if you're not careful, you will let the values of this world dictate decisions that you make. And when you do that, you can end up in some really bad places living for the wrong things. But if you let Christ dictate the decisions that you're going to be making, it's going to lead you to a place of rest. And that's such a nice place to be. And so when we think about our lives and all the different majors that are represented in this room, you must keep in mind that there's something big that God is doing. It's the Great Commission. It's the gospel going to the world. And how does our life fit into that? It doesn't mean you got to go to, Somali and pass out gospel tracts and start Bible studies and build churches. It may be, though. But there's a big picture of what's going on here. And work is good. All work that we engage in is good. It's a service to other people, providing something that they need, making our world a functioning place. It's a really good thing to do. But all of it's got to fit into this greater purpose of what God's all about. That's why Christ came. He came to do the will of the Father. Well, why do you think God adopted us into His family? To do His will as well. And so as we yoke ourselves to Christ, that's where we're going to find rest. And I just encourage all of you, think about your life, think about your vocation in light of eternity, in light of yoking yourself to Christ, because that's where life is going to be found. And that's where you're going to find life is worth living when you live it at that particular level, that particular pace, being yoked with Christ. Okay, all right, we got to get on. I feel like I'm a little dad here. Look at that very last paragraph, bottom of page 7. God is working with a clear and united plan to redeem His creation to Himself. He is not, and this becomes important, He is not working from plan A to plan B to plan C. The Abrahamic covenant worked. Let's try the Mosaic covenant. That was no good. Davidic, that was awful. The new. Everything is moving forward. But everything that precedes the new, those were shadows of the something better that was coming. That's the whole argument of Hebrews. When you get into the book of Hebrews, basically, one way to understand the book of Hebrews is for it to be saying, this is what it's been all about all along. These weren't just stupid covenants that should never happen. These were shadows of something greater to come. And so Christ is the better way. His sacrifice is the better sacrifice. The new covenant is the better covenant. It's the better. That's the word that's used throughout. Not the only, not the main thing, and all this other was a bunch of garbage. But it's the better one, and everything was moving us toward that eventually. So it all fits together and moves toward the purposes of His overall purposes. And we're now a part of that in our lives. But look at point D. This is where I really wanted to get with this whole discussion. When we get to point D, we want to talk about the primary concern of the prophets. Okay, it is the Mosaic covenant. That's the concern. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, the concern is the Mosaic covenant. So remember, we're not dealing with, are you in or out of the family? Because Abrahamic faith deals with that. What we're dealing with is the relationship with God. They're in a covenant relationship. And Israel is walking away from God and following after other gods, idols. So the nation of Israel had entered into a covenant relationship with Yahweh. There were privileges with this covenant, but also responsibilities. When the nation obeyed the covenant, then there was blessing. But when they disobeyed, there was cursing. And that's found in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28 and 29. And so covenant. And so that's why in your reading of different books, you're going to see a lot of reference to this unfaithfulness in relationship to Yahweh. And this picture, because it's a covenant that is most dear to humanity, is the covenant between a husband and a wife. That's when we really understand the depth of commitment, the depth of covenant. In the prophets, they're going to use this imagery oftentimes. And so when Israel walks away from her covenant responsibilities, she's going to be referred to as what? When she's rebelling against the Lord, a what? Prostitute. A whore. A harlot. Okay, that's the kind of imagery you're going to have. And some of it is quite graphic even, because it's trying to drive home the point. This is what that's like. Imagine your spouse flaunting him or herself to another lover, what is that going to engender inside of you? What are you going to feel from that? And the Lord is trying to make that clear. Well, what do you think I feel? We're in a covenant relationship and you're off gallivanting around with your other gods. Ray Ortland Jr. came out with a book a few years back where he studied the whole concept of Israel's unfaithfulness. And the first edition of his book he called Whoredom. That was the name of the book, Whoredom. And then it came out the second time, and it was the title of the book was God's Unfaithful Wife. So there was a few outcries about the title of that book, wasn't there? I went out and found a first version copy of that book, first edition, because that's really what the prophets get at. Forget the book publishers. Oh, we got to tone this down a little bit, and God's Unfaithful Wife. Whoredom was a good title for that book, and you're going to see that in the prophets. That image is powerful. That's the primary concern. It's a covenant relationship. I wear 2 wedding rings. One of them was my grandfather's, who was married to my grandmother for 50 whatever years. And so when he died and my dad offered me the opportunity to have his ring, I stuck it right on my hand and I said, if he was faithful to my grandma all those years, I'll just have a double reminder here. I'm married to Joni and look at my grandfather. I actually wanted to give it to my son as a promise ring, but it wasn't cool enough. So I still wear it to this day. All right, the prophets were Yahweh's attempts to spare the people of the ultimate judgment. Now he has them in the land, and they have a wonderful experience in the land as long as they live obediently. But the Lord is trying to spare them from this ultimate judgment. He wants to keep them in a place of blessing. So he issued a continual call to his people to respond to their responsibilities of the covenant so they could enjoy the blessings of the covenant. So again, Deuteronomy 28, 29, Leviticus 26 is where all this is found. If they disobeyed, then they were going to experience all the curses of the covenant. And so you can read down through that list. It's a bizarre list to read, Deuteronomy 28 and 29. Just bizarre, because it talks about the fever, the itch, and consumption. I mean, it's all these things. You're going, what? And then you read the history of Israel. You don't really see all of this stuff, exactly what they're talking about. But what we do see is enemy nations come in and oppress them and then eventually take them out of their land. And that becomes the difficult part for them. Okay? And so God is trying to work with Israel to help them maintain this sense of being His people, being in a place of blessing, enjoying the land, enjoying all the privileges that come with that. But when they get out, then they experience the curses of that. Now you see there on the middle of page 8, it says, note the storyline of the Old Testament. Whoever had me for Old Testament history and lit, what are the storyline books of the Old Testament? Okay, Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, Ezra and Nehemiah. Those 11 books are what I would call the storyline. So you've got Genesis, you've got Exodus, you've got Numbers, Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, Ezra and Nehemiah. Okay? That's the story of the Old Testament. Now, it's important for us to understand how the prophets fit into this story. And so you've got all of God's dealings with His people. And then finally, when we get to 2nd Kings and Ezra and Nehemiah, basically that's where the prophetic books fit. If you understand historically where they fit, it's in the books of 2nd Kings, Ezra, and Nehemiah. So this is during the kingdom period. And this is following David even. And so we're into the kings of actually these prophets will begin back in 1st Kings. It's just easy to remember it as 2nd Kings, Ezra, Nehemiah. And so in this kingdom period, We have the kingdom divided after Solomon's days, and then we have all these kings of the north and all these kings of the south, and Israel is going to have an up and down experience with the Lord, mostly down. And so historically, it's in these books, 2 Kings, Ezra, Nehemiah, that the prophets have their ministry, and they are calling people back to covenant faithfulness so that they can experience the blessings. And so God is constantly just coming after his people. Now, look here, point number 3. The prophets were Yahweh's attempts to spare the people. They were Yahweh's attempts to spare the people of the ultimate judgment. Okay? Of the ultimate judgment. He issued a continual call to his people to respond to their responsibilities to the covenant so they could enjoy the blessings. Now, point number 4 there is the failures of the nations culminated in the displacement of the northern kingdom by the Assyrians, never to return to the land, and the deportment of the southern kingdom to Babylon, who returned after 70 years. So there's going to be 2 major exiles. One's called the Assyrian exile, and one is called the Babylonian exile. Now, the Assyrian exile, we really never hear from that group again. They're dispersed. Enemy nations are actually brought in. They cohabitate with the people of the land, and we end up with the, I'm losing the word, the woman at the well, Samaritans. We end up with the Samaritans, and so they were considered less than Jews. Whereas the southern kingdom, they go into Babylon, and then they're going to come back into the land after 70 years. So notice that very last point on page 8, Yahweh's loving kindness is evidenced by his perseverance with the nation and continued patience in waiting for his people to return to him. When we read through these books, we're going to see Israel's running. God's pursuing. Now, the problem with reading the minor prophets that we're going to be doing is we are not always connecting it to the history. You've got to understand, this is taking place in 2 Kings, Ezra, Nehemiah. It's good at some point in time to go back and read those books so that you can go, oh, this is what was going on while these prophets were preaching their sermons. You got to make that connection between the two. If you don't make that connection, these are just isolated bunch of weird judgment stuff. But if you bring it back here and you realize that Israel had a revival and then they fell again, and the prophets were God's attempts to bring them back into the circle of blessing so that he could pour out blessing on them, and then they responded with some kind of revival, and then they turned away again, and God came back. Eventually, you see exactly why he sent the northern kingdom into the Assyrian exile. You can see exactly why. There were no good kings in the northern kingdom following Solomon. None. After the division of the kingdom, not one single good king. And that left God with, if we can say this, no choice but to enact the worst possible punishment they could have, exile. And they never returned. The southern kingdom, out of all those kings, there's only 8 that are good. And so you've got up and down, mostly down. And then God eventually enacts that judgment with them as well. So that's the big picture of some of what we're trying to accomplish here. Now, on top of page 9, the prophetic message is not focused on the future. Okay? Very important for us to understand this. Rather, it is focused on the present, talking about the present for when it was written. Its message seeks to call out holy living on the part of Yahweh's people. The messages concerning the future, see, notice this, are only necessary to announce coming judgment if disobedience persists. So, what's this point trying to make? God's people daily are making decisions either to follow him or not. And when the flow of the people is away from the Lord, God sends prophets to proclaim a message to them. And it's not so concerned about the future, it's concerned about the now. They need to get back into a faithful relationship with the Lord. That's the primary concern of what the prophets are trying to do. In the present, get them back into a covenant relationship. The only time the messages begin to move towards the future is, Israel, if you do not turn back to me, then, and then there's a perspective on a future judgment that may take place. And then also thrown in there for free, future judgment, but God's going to do something. He's going to do something miraculous. And that's where the prophets start looking at the new covenant. Because they can't keep tablets of stone, something greater is going to take place. The law is going to be written on the heart. But also, not only just the new covenant, but just this eternal kingdom where Christ will rule and reign and people will respond to Him and follow Him. So, the future messages also reveal Yahweh's unfolding plan of a future judgment which will end all evil and usher in His future kingdom of righteousness. In other words, some of the prophetic message is yet to be fulfilled. It is still future to us. But that's a very little bit. 95% of everything you read in the prophets, done, gone, historical. Okay? Still future to us, less than 2%. Of what you find in prophetic literature. So from the time of the prophetic message, it was all done. And then some of it looks forward to Christ, and then some of it is still future to us. But 97% of it is all in the past for us right now. We're still looking forward to this final scene of God's plan. Everything else is behind us. But overall, the message is one of relationship. Yahweh wants relationship with His people. And that's what you really have to keep in mind. And the reason you have to keep that in mind is because you're going to be reading some really difficult stuff in the days ahead. I've already talked to you about this probably a couple of times. Judgment, 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 judgment. But you are going to need to see the hope that is also sprinkled in here. This is about relationship. One of these days, do we have any parents in here? Anyone a parent? Okay, one of these days you'll be parents. And you'll have kids. And you will understand God's love for His people far more than you do right now. I really think being a parent adds a dimension to your life that will help you understand God as Father and why He does what He does. And it will help you understand how heartbreaking it is to discipline someone you love so much. Now, some of you might be young enough where you're still on the other end of your parents' discipline, and you think, oh, they're just trying to wreck my world, those lousy parents, oh, and you just feel this way towards it all. But when you get on the other end of it, and you have to tell your son or your daughter that this thing that they've been looking forward to is now being removed and they will not be allowed to go. Mom and Dad go back to the bedroom and just, I just can't believe we had to do that. Oh my goodness. Oh, let's go. Just run away. You know, I mean, it just hurts so bad. But when you know it's the right thing to do. And so I want you to keep that in mind. Overall, it's relationship. And God is jealous for His people. His wife is out cavorting with other men, and He's not going to let that stand. He's going to go, and He's going to deal with it. That's what you have going on here. And God is so faithful in doing that. Okay, you with me? All right, still got 15 minutes here. Let's go to page 11. And we've got prophecy in the prophetic books. The first line there is reiterating the prophetic books fit within the time period of the divided kingdom, the solitary kingdom, the post-exilic kingdom. Now look, I've got 1 Kings 12 there through 2 Kings, Ezra, Nehemiah, but the easiest way to remember it is 2 Kings, Ezra, Nehemiah. Okay? But it does go back in the 1 Kings. You need to understand basically from the time the kingdom divides after Solomon into the north and the south, that's where prophets begin to play a role from that point on. And we're talking about the literary prophets for the most part. Okay, so let's look at this section right here. And this is the main message. When we try to pull all the prophets together, beginning with Isaiah and going all the way through the end of the Old Testament, God seeks to call His people back to a life that evidences obedience to the covenant. Now, some prophecies will be directed toward other nations. But see, that's part of God's plan as well. You have messed with my people. I will now deal with you. That's part of his covenant relationship. I protect my people. I watch over my people. Your enemies will run in the opposite direction from you. I will keep you safe. And so even though God uses enemy nations to bring discipline on Israel, God actually deals with them in the end as well. But the primary focus is God seeks to call his people back to a life that evidences obedience to the covenant. Now, when you look at prophetic origins, okay, when you get to point A here, underneath the introduction to the prophets, the origins of prophecy is uncertain, and we aren't going to spend a lot of time in here. It's just not something I want to do. What I've got is the conclusion right here for you. I think that will be most helpful to you. But those are some resources, and you got point C at the top of page 12. But the resources that are there help you understand that there is origin to all of this. In other words, this is the point trying to be made. When you get to the Bible and you start reading about prophecy, the Israelites and God didn't make up prophecy in the prophets. This was very much a cultural phenomenon. There were people in other cultures, other civilizations, other nations that function in this way. And just like so many things we find in the Bible, God uses what is already within the culture to accomplish his purposes. So the idea of this important person who could maybe look into the future or proclaim words of wisdom was not foreign to the nation of Israel. They were used to this kind of stuff. They saw this kind of stuff function. So just like temple and sacrifice, prophecy was a general phenomenon in the ancient world of the Bible. Origins cannot be traced to any one culture. The Old Testament seems to ground prophecy's origin in the call of Yahweh. So when we talk about Israelite prophecy, it's grounded in the call of Yahweh. It's not someone who just decides they want to become a prophet one day. So it's not something you could study at Biola University. I'd like to study prophecy, and that's going to be my goal in life, to be a prophet. It's grounded in the call of Yahweh in the Bible. So he used prophets to reveal his will for Israel and to speak about matters of judgment and salvation. So how does God communicate with the nation of Israel? Well, he's going to do it through prophets. How do people connect with God? Well, they do that through the priest. And so God has all these different offices that he used throughout the Old Testament. Okay, you got that? Prophetic origin. Working on that last one. Because the next thing that we want to do, the next topic, is we want to understand some of the descriptive terms that are used for these individuals who were considered prophetic figures. We're thinking of the concept right now, prophet. But there are different words that are used to bring this about. As we look at the development in the Old Testament, we look at the important people who walked around the nation and they were able to be the kind of people who proclaimed. So let's look at some of those descriptive terms. There are 5 of them. This first slide has the man of God, the seer, and the visionary. So what I'm bringing out here is when you read through the Bible, the Old Testament, you will find these terms. And so man of God is one. This is one possessed by God for special service. Okay? It's obviously recognized that there's a special function that this person has. And so every time you see man of God used, there is some kind of special function from God. And then we have a seer. You know, just take off the R and you see the word see, and that gives everything you need to know about that word. Descriptive of the individual's experience, emphasizing extraordinary insight, often times into the future or into affairs that no one else was familiar with. So this person was seen as being able to have this private knowledge that no one else had. And then we also see the visionary. The visionary is also one who is used. And this again is descriptive of the individual's experience, emphasizing the method of reception by means of visions and dreams. So for man of God, you can go to passages like 1 Samuel chapter 9 and verses 7 and 8, would be an idea. In fact, you can find number 1, number 2, and what we're going to see in just a moment, number 5, all of them mentioned in 1 Samuel chapter 9, verses 6 through 10. These are terms that could actually be used somewhat interchangeably, okay? And so you're just going to find them in various places. But this is descriptive, again, of an individual's experience, emphasizing the method of reception. In other words, where did this person get their extraordinary insight? You're going to have some similarities here. It was through visions or through dreams. So this person was a visionary. A seer would be one who simply could see into things that others could not. A visionary would actually receive different visions and dreams. And I think God still works that way, even around the world. You know, around the world, they in different places that I've been, 2 different places I've been. When I was down in Brazil, some guy came to me and said, I think that you are an interpreter of dreams. I said, seriously? Okay, because it was prophesied over me the day before by some lady who had the gift of prophecy down there. And so he explained to me this dream that he had. And I looked at the guy that was translating and I said, what am I supposed to say? I don't interpret dreams. He goes, just tell him whatever you think when you hear his dream. So he told me this long, elaborate dream. I never have dreams with this much elaboration to it, but he told me the long, elaborate dream, and I said, well, this is what I think. And I went on to tell him what I think, and tears are flowing down his face. The translator starts crying too. I'm sitting there going, whoa, what's going on? He goes, you are an interpreter of dreams. And this guy, I mean, it was just this crazy thing. So then I was in Nigeria, and some guy came up to me and said, I have a dream, and the Lord wants me to come and talk to you about my dream. I said, well, down in Brazil, they said I'm an interpreter of dreams, so hey, tell me your dream. So he told me this dream, and tears started coming down his face. So I don't know. Maybe I'm a visionary as well. Who knows? It seems it helped them, whatever it was helpful. A diviner, and then a prophet. So prophet is the other one that's found in 1 Samuel 9, verses 6 through 10. But a diviner, used of those who practice formal divination. Now this is definitely an ancient Near Eastern concept, that of divination. Perhaps using many other methods of determining the will of a deity. So you would try to divine from the god some information. And they would do lots of weird things. But the term is not applied to those who receive legitimate sanction in the Old Testament. So in other words, when you see the word diviner or soothsayer in the Old Testament, although that was an ancient Near Eastern concept that all of Israel would have understood exactly who this is not generally used in a legitimate sense. These are the bad guys. These are the pagan prophets, so to speak, in the Old Testament. But they would do things like open up animals and try to look at the innards, entrails, whatever the proper term for that is, bowels. And from that, they would discern things. They would divine in that kind of way. You see this used with Joseph at the end of Genesis, where he's got the cup of divination, okay? And so there's something going on there with Joseph too. He's in that culture where this was just accepted, but not in the Bible is this considered legitimate. And then we have the prophet, and of course that's going to be a major focus for what we have in this class. Prior to the literary prophets, now notice this term, we're going to talk about it in just a moment, but prior to the literary prophets, those who actually wrote down messages that are preserved for us in the Bible, there is little distinction between the terms man of God and prophet. So you can find those two terms distinguished. Once we get into the literary prophets, then prophet becomes the sanctioned term for those who are receiving a message from God to bring to people. With the dawn of the literary prophets, prophet becomes the more common name. And so if someone's receiving a message from God, they're no longer considered a man of God. Prophet becomes the general term that is used. Okay? So each one of these are looking at the same concept within the ancient Near Eastern world. Each one of these terms is used in the Bible and they are related. However, one of them is not generally considered a legitimate person or source for information from God. You follow me on that? So you'll see all 5 of these terms. They're all related. This one's not sanctioned in the Old Testament. The rest of them will be, and will be used somewhat interchangeably. Now, one last thing before we go, okay? Because Jeff Hand's tired, and so we got to call it a class period. What is the relationship to other Old Testament offices? Like the passage I was in yesterday in Ezekiel 22 was talking about the priest, the prophet, the princes. Well, you've got all these things going on in the Old Testament. What is their connection? So here's prophets number 4. And I want you to think about judges, kings, priests, because you're going to see all of these to varying degrees. Judges, they judge people righteously according to the law. So especially during the time period of the judges, I mean, where they're mostly military rulers, there was a sense in which they were supposed to be pointing people toward the law some. Moses, because he had so many people, what did he do? He appointed judges to work with them about interpretations of the law. All right? So if someone had a case, they brought it to a judge, and that person and that judge then decided that case based on the law that God had given. Now, kings were to rule according to the law. They were to be Abrahamic believers, and they were to put themselves under the law and lead the people toward the law so that they could know God and live within that circle of blessing. Priests and Levites, they taught the law. They also lived it out in the sacrificial system, in the temple, but there was also a teaching part to that. You know, Ezra, a Levite, teacher of the law. And then prophets, they teach the Lord's will specifically for the current situation. So what the prophet did is really worked in accordance with all of these other offices, but their specific focus was not just teaching the law, but in a specific situation, Israel is walking away or whatever might be the instigating incident, they speak in to that situation. Thus saith the Lord. Now they aren't giving new information. That's so important for you to understand. It's not new information. They're taking what the people already know about the law. They've been taught the law, but now through the Lord, they are bringing that to bear upon a particular situation. All right? So we'll pick it up there.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.